All right, welcome everyone to Northern Illinois University Art Museum's virtual panel discussion this afternoon, Reanimated Stories. I'm Stuart Henn, the museum's education coordinator, and it's my pleasure to welcome you and introduce our moderator today. A few notes about the presentation. This Zoom event is being recorded, so you can rewatch or invite others who are not able to join us live today. The video will be uploaded to our events page after it's been formatted for web viewing. To minimize interruptions, everyone has been muted except our moderator and panelists. Feel free to ask questions in the chat, and I'll help moderate those at the end of the presentation, time allowing. Programs of the NIU Art Museum are sponsored in part by the Illinois Arts Council Agency through federal funds provided by the National Endowment for the Arts, the Friends of the NIU Art Museum, the College of Visual and Performing Arts season presenting sponsor Shaw Media, and the NIU Arts and Culture Fee. This afternoon, our conversation and discussion is moderated by Randy Kesperson, Associate Professor, Media Studies in the Department of Communications at Northern Illinois University, where he teaches film, television, and video production, as well as screenwriting. Kespersons is a filmmaker and has previously worked in the television industry in Los Angeles. Portions of the exhibition, Storied Reference, is viewable on a virtual format found online at www.niu.edu/artmuseum/exhibitions. I'll post those URLs in the chat. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce and turn our screen over to Professor Kesperson.
Thank you so much. Just one question before we get started. In addition to that web address you gave us, you also said that a few of the films we'll be talking about, the whole part of them, the whole films will be linked. Is that correct, Stuart?
Yes, those are also in the chat as well.
Okay, in the chat. And will they be on a website or like with the Zoom recording later?
Yeah, I can post those as well. I can post
the ones that we're able to. Yeah, that'd be awesome.
Absolutely.
Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much, Stuart, for getting us started. I'm so excited to have these four artists here. For those of you who've been to the Storied References exhibit or not, it's really cool. There's a lot of paintings, collage work, photography, sculptures. And I wanted to read just a tiny bit about the exhibit from the exhibit sign, just to give you a little bit of context in case you didn't read it on the website or what have you. And I took a picture of the sign, so I'm going to read it from the picture of the sign that I have. I won't read the whole thing, just a little bit, and then we'll meet our artists. It's called Storied References. Of late, we hear how important it is to tell one's story and to hear one another's story. We have come to recognize that while experience is individual, context also matters. Locating the personal within a larger, perhaps even universal narrative gives a story a greater meaning. We can see a reflection of others' lives in our own. But what is it to refer to a known story, be that myth, legend, fable, fairy tale, folk tale, or proverb from written or oral source? So that's kind of the question that begins kind of when you walk into the space. And it goes on and asks more questions about that, what is it to use another story when you tell your own story, wherever you find that story. So I think that's something that plays in the background, obviously, of the whole exhibit and ties it together, and something we'll be looking at today. So, but without further ado, let's meet our four film artists. If it's okay with you, or I shouldn't say film, I'm so used to saying film because I'm a filmmaker, but our four artists who work in the visual medium in all sorts of ways. I'm gonna go through it in the order I did the clips. We'll be watching a few clips, clip from each movie in a little bit. But I'm gonna talk to you all in the order of those clips, just because it'll be easiest for me. And the first person we're gonna hear from is Jason Tannen. If you would introduce yourself and just tell us a little bit about either your educational background, your point of view as an artist, the kind of work you like to do, whatever it is you'd like to say about that. Jason?
Okay, well, thank you very much. Hi, everyone. And I want to thank Randy and Stuart. I'm really excited to be here, excited to be part of today's screening and also part of this really great exhibition. So a little bit about myself. I'm a photographer, a gallery curator, and educator. I got my, received my MFA, my master's degree from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and my BFA from Tyler School of Art in Philadelphia. Um, so talking about my work, for over 30 years, my work has explored the urban landscape. An ongoing inspiration for me has been film noir, crime films from the 1940s and 50s with their urban locations, stark black and white, intricate plots, and their atmosphere of mystery and foreboding. Um, some of film noir's key themes and symbols that I've incorporated into my work include the city at night, desolate streets with deep shadows and harsh side lighting, mirrors and reflections, which often suggest human duality, telephones, letters, signs that can be symbols of miscommunication, images of transportation that can suggest entrapment, and overall a sense of anticipation. I think that's about all I want to say about my work. I can talk about the film very briefly. Should I do that, Randy?
We'll meet everyone, and then we're going to have everyone kind of
Great.
tell us a little bit about their piece, and then we're going to watch the clips. So,
So-
but that was a great, those were a lot more things than I would have been able to say. So I'm so glad.
Good.
All right, next, let me go through my sheets. Sarah Martin, please introduce yourself and a little bit about who you are as an artist.
Thanks, Randy. And I also want to thank Stuart and Joe and the museum curators and staff and students who have helped put this together. So my name is Sarah. I'm an assistant professor of graphic design, but I was kind of traditionally trained in painting at the University of Maryland. I grew up outside of DC. And I also have a degree in literature. And so those two things, formal visual communications and written semiotic communications, kind of come together for me in visual communication design and thinking about how we communicate and who our audiences are. And so I'm an artist, but I'm also a designer. And I did my MFA at the University of Notre Dame. And I'm still in Indiana at Indiana University. And so my work looks at the medium of the fairy tale. So storytelling as a didactic but also pleasurable and enjoyable space. I look at the typographic, the use of typography and the use of illustration. I'm also an illustrator. But I'm interested in kind of dissecting and unpacking the space of the dark fairy tale as a space of diversion and perversity. I think about the fairy tale as kind of rich with the unknown, and thus a really kind of exploratory space, but it's also very dangerous. If we have the safety and normalcy and conformity of traditionally like the house as a visual narrative, my work tries to take us outside of the house. In German, this is called the Heimlich. And it is a space of kind of untamed wilderness. It's where we are uncomfortable, but that space is also a really like I said, rich space for possibility and change. So I think about this in my artistic work and my video work, and also in my design work to some extent, as this kind of like uncomfortable pushing against the bounds of what is normal. And I'm excited to talk about share my thoughts about my piece shortly.
Thank you, Sarah. All right, Richard Alvin Gessart, you are next.
Hi, I'm Richard. Similar to Jason, I studied at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, but I studied there as an undergraduate. I do live and work in Chicago at the moment. I work at both the University of Chicago and Northwestern University. My background is in art and design, so similar to Sarah. My interests usually deal with the gap between art in daily life, thinking about the difference in context between fine art and visual art, and thinking about how the setting of my artwork influences its meaning. So far, my work usually takes the form of printed materials, found objects, artist books, and videos. So I think for me, with Storied References, the video that I've exhibited touches on my interests in cultural and historical issues.
Excellent. And if anyone's wondering, the image behind Richard is a picture of Lake Michigan that he took last week.
Oh my.
And it's
So,
right, it's not just, it's lovely, and tells the story, right? I think we're all feeling some relief as it's, well, you're not necessarily all from here like us, but it's been in addition to COVID and winter always being sort of a challenge by February, it's been a rougher than usual February in all sorts of ways, including the weather. So it's always nice to see things start to break up.
the transitional period.
And the way things smell different and feel different, and 30 degrees feels like a hot day. It's so nice, but it's a beautiful image. So thank you so much. All right, fine. Last, but of course not least, let's talk to Bridget.
Hello, everybody. I'm thrilled to be here. I must say, I was very excited to be curated into this show. And after I got to look at the images online and to be part of this panel and see snippets of the video, I'm even more excited because my entire career as a visual artist has been involved with storytelling and taking parts of various stories, mostly old stories that I want to remake and think about our time period now, but not necessarily set them in the now. And so one of the things that I do with my work is I create alternate universes, and my reds and grays are the subject of my work for the last 8 or 9 years now. And I create these small little figures. You can see one behind me. And then I mix them up in all kinds of different ways that happen as I explore the topic. And it's a sci-fi world. It's not a world that exists in any kind of reality, but I pull from stories that are known, things like one of my biggest concerns is income inequality, power inequality, justice. So these are the kinds of things I deal with in my work. And to back up a little bit, I live in Boston, and I got my MFA at the Lesley University College of Art and Design. Also studied at the museum school. But I would say more of a influence on my work was my undergraduate work in Japan, where I studied traditional theater and went to lots of bunraku, which are the puppets of traditional theater in Japan. And so I see all the work that I didn't know I was doing back many years ago has now come forward in my own work.
Thank you for that, Bridget. Yeah, I watched all your pieces at NIU at the Art Museum without reading a single word about you guys. And it was really, and we're gonna hear you talk about these pieces in a second, really enjoyable to watch them that way. And then the pleasure of sort of trying to unravel some of the references. And Bridget's piece specifically has all sorts of different worlds I feel being referenced, and it was fun to be like, that feels familiar, that feels new. These two things together feel both new and unexpected, and that's kind of the goal of the whole, the familiar with the strange of these storied references. So, all right, we're in just a minute or two, well, maybe a little longer than that, we're gonna see some clips from each one of the artists' pieces. But could each artist tell us the title of their piece and then maybe just a short little bit of information about it? You could call it a pitch, a log line, whatever you want, a quick summary, whatever you want to tell us about to kind of whet our appetites. Let's go back through our order, just to be orderly. Jason, tell us about your film.
Okay, my film's title is The Pressman Negatives, and the images in the film are from this film noir inspired photography that I described earlier. The Pressman Negatives is a photographic narrative that explores issues of time, memory, and truth. It traces the story of a group of crooks and their dark world in a Midwestern city in the 1970s. Through snapshots taken by one of them and discovered years later by me, it documents their final days.
Wow.
End pitch.
Stay tuned for a little bit more of it, yes. And it does all those things. All right, next up we have Sarah Martin. Tell us a little bit, I don't want to say the title so you can say it, but tell us about your piece.
Sure, thanks, Randy. The title is Wishes and Fractured Vision. It's an original and contemporary stop motion piece. It is all hand animated stop motion. And it explores the consequences of outproducing your past. And so again, I'm looking at that perversion where we're stepping outside of the normal. But in this space, in this particular piece, I'm looking at expansionism and capitalism while still trying to reckon with a nostalgia and a history, and what it's almost like proposing what a fairy tale might look like long into the future, in which we've built completely on top of ourselves and buried our history and what that longing and looking back might look like. In the stop motion vignettes that you'll see, there's a city, like I said, images of a city that's buried itself under its own greed for the sake of kind of progress, for the sake of progress. This is a very old narrative. But ultimately, there are no princesses. I'm kind of deconstructing traditional narrative fairy tale structures. There are no princesses, no happily ever afters. It eschews a lot of formulas that you might see and that particularly like common viewers and consumers of fairy tale might expect, especially in like the highly whitewashed and commercialized Disney adaptations of things. And it really does seek to return to that darkness that I described that sits outside the house, that just outside the ring of your candlelight aura is where my fairy tale seeks to kind of inhabit. Apologies for my dog.
Part of the fun is the pets. I had a lot of fun reading yours, other than it being beautifully written and very kind of made me think about fairy tales specifically. Your work was dealing with was, I teach a history of animation course and they're so steeped in Disney. Some of them, there's this whole Disney cult, not just the popular culture, but this worldview almost that they so buy into. And so I really enjoyed what how you're trying. One of the things you talked about is maybe you didn't say anti-Disney, I don't think, but the idea that you're maybe, subverting that and trying to do something else, not only with fairy tales, but with their way of telling them. All right, thank you so much. So Richard, tell us about your piece.
My piece is called our so-called post-colonial puppy. It explores the power dynamics between owner and pet, man and man's best friend. The idea originally came from witnessing Lulu, my family dog, responding to both Vietnamese and English at home. I thought it was interesting because it appeared that Lulu was bilingual, although dogs do not have an understanding of language in the anthropological sense. And for me, I found Lulu's relationship to language to be a bit ironic, considering that her breed is French. She's a bichon frisé, but she doesn't know any French. So I'm playing on this irony and simply considering the history of French Indochina, how France once colonized China, is where this aspect of myth comes into play for me, and we can get into that later during our discussion. I will say that my piece is tongue-in-cheek because Lulu, after all, doesn't speak. She's a dog. Instead, I'm constructing this narrative around her as a hybrid creature.
I'm just thinking back on the piece. Yes, but she's quite a fascinating character. All right, thank you so much. Bridget, tell us, you've already kind of talked a little bit about this when you previously spoke, but just tell us a little more about the piece.
Sure. The name of my piece that I'm presenting is called Gray Days, and it's so far the 5th of a series of my Red and Gray World videos. And I call it the Red Baiters series because the Red Baiters are a subset of the Grays. And the Grays, although they have to work for the Reds are powerful. They live in the 18th century. They have beautiful costumes, palaces, leisure. They can do whatever they want. The Grays have to work. But they, in some ways, they know things because they have purpose and they have agency. And so the Red Baiters are the resistance to the fact that they are being constantly buffeted by the whims of the Reds. And I have as my two leaders of the different factions in this particular Gray Days series, the Vizier, who is a horse-headed man, and the Wolf Man, who has a wolf head. They both have big teeth. And the teeth is symbolic as they're both pretty violent. And one of the things I'm trying with this particular video is to explore, are there other ways of solving problems besides violence? Because I see this dichotomy of power imbalance as one of the big issues of our day and of any day. And that's part of why I make this a time bending type of video where it doesn't fit in the 18th century, nor in our century. Maybe it's post-apocalyptic. We don't know. And that's besides the point. So that's what the video is dealing with.
Thank you, Bridget. And you can see or hear the story reference exhibit, how many different things trying to retell other stories and subvert them can bring up, because it's a huge range of different themes going on in all these artists' work. So without further ado, Stuart, can you roll them? Okay, that's probably a good sign. Okay, everyone, it's about 5 minutes.
The Pressman Negatives is a photographic narrative that explores issues of time and memory. It is the ostensibly true story of jewelry thief Sidney Pressman, his cohorts in crime, and the dark world they inhabited in a Midwestern city during the 1970s. It documents the final days of Pressman and his criminal colleagues brought together for one last heist, the burglary of a rare coin and jewelry store. An amateur photographer, Pressman, snapped these pictures during the crime's preparation, execution, and aftermath. They are presented here along with 2 newspaper clippings that corroborate the story and track its unhappy denouement.
As the alchemist's power grew, so did his malice. Stories spread throughout the bones of the alchemist's cruelty. Every townsman could tell the tale of the blind boy to whom the alchemist gave sight. Distracted by wood grains, the color of orange peels, thunderclouds, and the rest of his newly visible world. What is this? It's like the trees fall so the tall rings grow so wide. Is that where the stars? It's so very bright. It's like the sun.
Okay. So that's just a little taste of them. Just a quick note, we're still, I feel this way as all the time as I'm a film teacher, simulcasting via the Zoom and, Teams meetings and all that. Not perfect yet. Sync goes out of whack. Sometimes audio doesn't get picked up quite right. So there is a bit more sound, for example, in Richard's piece, our so-called post-colonial puppy, that it wasn't tracking quite right until a little bit towards the end. And it's got a really powerful soundtrack that's really important part of it. So I just wanted to note that, but we did at least get a taste of everyone's. But so I want to turn it back to the artist. Now that we've seen a little bit of your piece, I think the original question was going to be, how do you think your piece fits in with this storied references theme of the exhibit? And that's still part of what I'm about to ask. But I have the feeling I'm going to change it a tiny bit and ask each one of you and it'll probably bring up kind of the same answers, I think, at least it would for me. What drew you to this idea? What inspired you to get into, to tell this story this way, whether, whatever you want to say about that? What kind of brought you there? What's the inciting incident? I don't know if we'll call it that, but let's start with Jason.
Well, okay. So I think that looking back at my kind of source inspiration, which was and is film noir, and kind of at the same time being a single image, a still photographer, I think that from the get-go, I was always interested in finding ways to kind of, I don't know, reconcile or integrate or incorporate those two things, the idea of the moving image and the still photograph. And early on, one of the things that I thought about was the idea of establishing reaction and cutaway shots, which are foundational to film structure or cinema. And I used that framework when I was creating those photographs, the idea of a kind of establishing image, a reaction to that, a sort of more neutral kind of image. And the idea was that through the order or organization of presenting all of those photographs in a gallery exhibition, for example, I could suggest a variety of images or a variety of storylines or narratives. And that took various forms. This was pre-digital, creating a dimensional, a seedy motel room, and having a peephole, and looking in the peephole, you would be presented with basically a slideshow of all of my images. So kind of attaining a time-based situation that way. And then with the advent of digital, I was able to digitize those images and create a film version of the photographs. And I wanted to mention that the particulars of the narrative, the storyline, flowed from existing images that I was very familiar with, had used in a variety of ways. And so I started to build a narrative story for the film version. And I worked with a colleague of mine who's a writer who helped me keep what was a purposely convoluted story in line with film noir, keeping that comprehensible so you could watch this film and have some idea of what the story was. I guess well, I don't want to say too much about the film because there is some sort of mystery and surprise. And by the way, all of the characters' names in this piece are taken from various film noirs or film noir stories. And I think that's all I'll say before the film.
Well, and that's interesting that, you know, your story references weren't only film noir purely, but like you were saying, the grammar of how shots are built to create sequences, whole movies, how you pair them next to each other to create relationships. But also a lot of those photos you kind of took from your own archive. So you're almost in some ways, which is a detail you reveal in the credits, you're almost retelling your own story or retelling part of it. So it becomes another part of those story fabrics along with film noir and the grammar of filmmaking. So
right,
that's really interesting. All right, well, thank you. Sarah, tell us about what inspired you. I think you have a little bit already, but what got you started maybe on Witches and Fractured Vision? Maybe got you attracted to fairy tales or the ones you investigate?
Yeah, so there's a little bit of both, just to clarify. There's there is some retelling, not really in this piece though. This is an original fairy tale, but it looks at the convention of the genre and of the form, both in terms of like narrative structure, but also the things visually that tend to occur in terms of illustration, spacing, flow. I'm very much interested in other works that I do and in my design and artistic practice in the book. Obviously, as an object, it has a lot of history tied to what I'm talking about. And so this piece actually began, what's on show in this exhibit are two vignettes from a much larger body of work. And they function as if someone pulled you aside or you were laying down in bed and someone came down, sat on your bed next to you and told you a short fairy tale, but you get the sense that there's a much larger world in which these fairy tales exist. And that larger world has been built into a book form. It's also been digitized. So the format that you're actually seeing it's also, I should say, exhibited sometimes as vignettes, like actual oval vignettes, cast either onto walls or various spaces, projected, I should say, onto various spaces. And but it's also existed in like a digital book format that has kind of allusions to the codex and the structure of a normal, or I should say printed book, bound book. And the index in and of itself is something that I wanted to trouble with this piece as well. Linearity and our kind of conventional understanding of what the book object could be. So there are moments actually that I've designed into the much larger piece where users can interact with it. They can kind of dig deeper. There are like hidden, depending on what kind of platform it's on, there are hidden pieces in the story. So it's not just straight video, it's interactive web design or coded app design. It's existed in both. And so the idea that as we're telling the stories, we're also shaping them, and that we are, the retelling is also an act of creation and an act of self-telling as well. So as, various forms of, for example, as various forms of something like Little Red Riding Hood have existed throughout the ages, right? They are practicing, they are practicing gender, they're practicing class structure, they're practicing, they're really kind of telling about the society in which they're existing in that moment. And so I'm asking a viewer to be active in that and to see it at the very least, if not in some instances be active in it as well.
I have a quick question about when I was looking you up. I saw that it was part of a, I found it on Vimeo and it said part of a Spectre, a ghostly tale of tales of, did I write this right? Whispers and whimsy, or did it say wisps and whimsy?
Yes.
Part of a suite. Why are you like, what is that? What are you talking? Did you find that? But what I wanted to ask is, you know, I'm always scolding my kids when we shoot videos that they have to shoot landscape. But yours is in portrait, but does that have something to do with the interactive nature of how it sometimes plays in these different forms? And can you briefly just tell us about why it's like that instead of, you know, landscape?
Yeah, so it is alluding to a portrait book form, and it's been built into book forms. So you would actually view it in a kind of book form, and then when it is interactive, there are longer text pieces that accompany it that also reference that kind of codex as well. So again, it's exhibited in a variety of different ways, and I offered, you know, a variety of those ways to be exhibited. And this is given the pandemic a pretty easy, straightforward way to view it. But it is kind of referencing a traditional portrait book form because it has existed and does kind of, it is in conversation with those as well. It is kind of this in-between type of storytelling that's not really film, it's not really, you know, book or even online narrative, it's not digital text, it's kind of in between.
Well, and I can see it being, you know, it's always interesting now that we have all these screens, like seeing it this way that we sort of saw it, or see it on your phone or a tablet held this way, or I saw it in a gallery for the first time, all a little different. And it's really cool, the idea of it being a book and in portrait mode. I know I saw at least one of my students here, you still need to film in landscape when we do for video class. So, all right, as lovely as this is, thank you so much. All right, Richard, tell us just a little bit about how you got going with this piece or connected to it when you.
As I was working on this piece, I was inspired by the work of the scholar Panavong Narinder, who wrote a book called Phantasmatic Indochina. The book was a psychoanalysis of the representations of Indochina. He said that Indochina was fictional, it was a construct created by France. So that space wasn't called Vietnam, it was called the space between India and China. So for me, that was a starting point. And with that in mind, I think the way that I talk about Lulu is dramatic. It gestures towards myth, akin to the idea of how Indochina was a myth. So projecting onto Lulu, in short, says more about me than it does about Lulu, because she's just after all a dog. And for me, it's interesting to explore the conflicting relationship between human owner and dog in this manner. I think it's also important to note that humor is something that I employ to think through these issues. I'm turning what would otherwise be a rather serious conversation if it were a history about humans, but instead I'm using this caricature as an effective method for me. So Lulu's just a family dog, not a human. The narrative format is also useful for me because I find that it can encompass a multifaceted subject and it can discuss issues in a prolonged way. So it's different than a painting or a sculpture. So for example, I wanted to explore language and that had to be done explicitly. I wanted to have text in English, Vietnamese, and French. And that's why the video as a medium is an effective format for me.
I was gonna no, I'm not gonna say it. I'm gonna wait. All right. Yeah, you started with that person that inspired that, I don't know how to say his name, Panavong Narinder. And something that was said was when they were talking about Indochine being a myth that has never existed and yet endures in our collective imagination. And I think all the pieces are dealing with that tension between what we think something is and what it really is. And it gets back to that idea of, by telling these stories, we're retelling all sorts of things, and the retelling are these new creations. So I thought that was really interesting. So thank you. Let's blast again. Last but not least, Bridget, tell us. You've talked to us about. Tell us about your inspiration for getting started with grade A's.
Well, I've been making, as I mentioned, this is the 5th in the video series, and they're all very short, around 3 minutes. And as I create this fantastical world that doesn't exist except in my imagination and in installations or in now the videos, I discover new relationships among the various characters. And the horseman or the vizier, the red leader, and the wolfman were two of the very earliest sculptural characters I had made. And they always had this magical affect for me. But it wasn't until I had made a few more of the videos that I realized that I wanted to create them as these symbolic leaders of the two factions. But because I had always thought of them as sort of scary with their big teeth, they immediately took on this notion of solving problems through violence, which I don't find would be what I would want, but I find it so difficult to figure out how we do solve problems in different ways. So I think this whole video, Gray Days, is an exploration of kind of my worst fears in the hope that perhaps I will find something new. And actually, I think in terms of my thinking, that has happened a little bit. I'm planning a new series of the whole Reds and Grays video that I think might explore other ways that their whole situation could be looked at.
We've presented the problems. Now we might have some solutions. I don't know if that's quite what you meant, but
well, you know, for me, there's never any solutions. It's
right.
I don't want to be didactic. I want to be
we need answers.
Offering ideas, and you come up with what you think works, you know.
Yeah. Well, good. Well, something when I was approached about this series of films, Joe, who runs the museum, came up to me. She did it via email. She said maybe 2 of the pieces are animated, and we should do a program for them, and then the other 2. And I didn't know anything about the pieces, and I went and I'm like, I think they're all kind of, you know, they use a lot of animation techniques, all 4 of them, and except for maybe Bridget's film, don't really use any live action. At least not in the traditional sense. And so I was just wondering if any of you, and Jason's already talked a little bit about this moving image and still photography, but if you want to talk about what attracts you about, you know, animation, if you're willing to buy into that's how I'm seeing elements of all your pieces, as opposed to using conventional motion picture, whether it's video, whether it's actual film. Do you guys want to talk about the power of animation in your pieces, if you will, or the attraction to it? And we don't have to go in order this time. This is a volunteer. You can raise your hand. You can raise your hand or speak up. Anyone? Uh-oh. Okay, Jason's got his hand.
I just wanted to mention that looking at the samples, obviously we haven't seen the whole program yet, but I was really intrigued and impressed with the sort of old school or non-digital approaches that all of my fellow artists took, especially because I retired recently, but I taught at Chico State University and in the art department. And I saw so much computer generated animation that was just not that compelling, not that interesting, that I really love that about all of your animations. And I think that you really, I really kind of become immersed in the films, in the animations. So I just wanted to throw that out.
I can follow up with that, that it is a very intentional decision on my part to use stop motion animation because has historically been a precursor to Disney, which I talk about Disney not really because I'm interested in them in my own practice, but because I think a lot of people, when they think of animation, they think of that. And I'm interested in some of the pioneers of stop motion animation who happen to be women. And when I'm thinking about fairy tale as well, I'm thinking about typically trying to deconstruct a historically patriarchal space of fairy tale that again reinforces norms of gender and behavior that are very prescriptive, particularly to women or anyone who is not a kind of a cis-identifying man. And so, and the power structures that then flow out of that, right? So Lot Redinger is an early pioneer of the medium that Disney references and the animators reference and kind of capitalize on, but she's often lost to history as the pioneer of this medium. And so I'm very intentionally using that. There's a lot of some in this work, but in a lot of my other work too, black silhouette animation. And someone like Kara Walker, for example, who also does this style of animation, but also installations with black cut paper silhouettes, is an inspiration for my work. Again, because that medium seems very rich to unpack historical narratives that need to be either deconstructed or questioned. And Lot Redinger also used the black silhouette, black paper silhouette, cut paper, hand animated cut paper silhouette in her work. So those are the two people that I'm specifically looking at for something like this, and then in some of my other work as well. And it's intentional, it's gendered, and it's looking at the history of the form.
Well, and in my history of animation class, in the first week, we look at a lot of those techniques. This is 20 years before Disney ever does really much of anything. And the kids are always surprised at how unusual it is and how captivating and you know, the cutout, the silhouette animation, some of the stop motion they do. It's really cool. And I think it gets to Jason's point too about there's something really nice about, you know, not always the digital animation, but the sort of analog handmade stuff that can be really captivating. I'm always a sucker for it. Oh, here comes my cat. So, yeah, but I love that also that in the, you know, in the models you pick, there's also this retelling of, you know, the questions not only about Disney, but using a female animator from the early days. Really interesting. Either Richard or Beatrice want to talk at all about animation in your films?
Sure, I can say something. So
Sure.
it's interesting to think about animation in relation to my work, because initially when I was creating this work, I was looking at colonial postcards that were sent back in the day. So this is early 20th century. And as I was compiling images of Lulu, for this video, it's really just Lulu going on a walk around the neighborhood, but I took multiple images of her. So as I printed them and Xeroxed them, I put them together in almost a artist book format. Some of my other work takes the form of an artist book. So going from page to page, it's similar to going from slide to slide in a slideshow. So that's essentially how I went about constructing this video, was creating an actual slideshow and going through it with the text and image. So it was in effect a silent film, but when I added the audio, that was something that comes through in particular for the video in terms of having this emotive quality. So in a way, it does gesture toward perhaps stop motion animation or just thinking about silent film, but then being a little bit of a parody because it's not quite there, although it is similar to that. So essentially, as opposed to a still image or an artist's book, when I put everything together, that was where the idea of a verb really came into play, to be able to have a narrative, to have some kind of sense of action, or at least bringing the viewer from one point to the next. So I think for me, it's interesting to think about animation with regard to the work, and perhaps if it were not in this form, what other form could it be? But I found that this form was the most effective for me, and there was a pragmatic aspect there too.
Yeah, and as you were talking, I was thinking, oh, could you have done an alternate form where it was a series of postcards, you know, but you wouldn't have the motion, you wouldn't have the music. I'm glad you said that about that you Xerox each picture, because for me, when I was watching, and hopefully you're younger, you might not know this, but I went to film school in the 90s, and they were still optically printing, you know, like 16 millimeter and rephotographing it. And whenever you did that, you created all those great textures. And in that, even that in itself is a kind of retelling of something, right? Taking an existing thing and retelling it. And so your film, I'd call it a film, but the piece has that quality to me of something that's been rephotographed on film, even though I know it's Xerox. So it's really cool, that texturing of it, and then bringing it to life. So Beatrice, did you want to say anything? You don't have to if you don't want.
Oh, no, I just want to sort of jump in about how fascinating I'm finding what everybody is saying about their work, because I sort of have questions for everybody about how you approached it, but as you unpack it for us, I'm finding out how similar I feel to many of the ways you guys are thinking about telling a story, and how it's not straight line storytelling. It's sort of rethinking the structure of a story, and kind of trying to fit pieces into a format that will make viewers think. And I really have been enjoying all the different things people have been saying. And in terms of animation for my work, it's since I use 2D and 3D figures in my videos, the 3D ones sometimes have stop animation, or sometimes they're manipulated with a wire that holds them up, or a stick that moves them around. But a lot of times with both the 2D and 3D, I use digital motion methodology to make them get larger or smaller, or move around the image plane. So that's about all I have to say on what I do with it.
Well, even amongst the 4 films, if we call them all animation, it's a huge range of what you can do. They're still films, motion picture films to me, but they don't, except again, a little bit for your film, Bridget, there is some live motion stuff in there. They're doing it with mostly still, I'm just going to say broadly, stills being animated in some way. And it's so fascinating to me that I saw the program, and Joe didn't even realize she had done that, you know, curated that way. Well, now we're going to change gears a tiny bit. I have it's kind of the flip side. What I'd like to know, yesterday I was at they all had artists, and it had sort of a feminist theme from the same exhibit. But they were talking about portraits and sculptures, paintings. What's unique about everyone here, so they talked about everything visually and story-wise, but I'd like to hear if anyone wants to talk about how they approached the audio to your piece, whether it's the voiceover, whether it's the music, like in Richard's piece, there's the singing in Gray Days. How did you guys approach the music or audio? And were you thinking about old stories with that? Were you just thinking about the technical aspects? How did you approach designing your audio for your pieces? Would anyone like to jump in? Okay, Beatrice, we'll start with you.
It's Bridget, by the way. I
just said Beatrice. I wrote it down wrong.
No, I know, that's okay, because the
Bridget, I'm sorry, I have it written down now, right?
Yeah, no, that's okay.
But I appreciate it.
For me, they really go hand in hand. Often when I'm designing a work, I compose and work out a lot of the audio, even though I don't know yet what's going to be happening in the video imagery. But the audio kind of drives the piece, and the notion that Richard was talking about of a sort of silent film also appeals to me. I don't have dialogue in my work. Sometimes in other works, I have little placards like Richard has that give information, but it's the emotional driver is the audio. So I create various pieces about what I'm thinking about. And then as I start to gather my images, then I start laying down the audio, and then that sets the pace for me for the video. It's really, I can't work one without the other.
Yeah, I imagine that's often the story with, again, I'm going to reference animation, you know, the voice often leads some of the characters and you animate to the voices. That's not exactly the same as what you're saying, but it's really powerful that you would start with that. And you're not even dialogue driven. You're doing it with all sorts of other kinds of audio kind of leading the piece.
We obviously continue and really, really focus on just trying to succeed and try to grow. But you know what, we've hit an amazing goal these last few months, and we don't need no 5-star badge.
What was that? Was that like someone, was he talking to us?
I'm not sure.
It's weird.
I couldn't understand it.
No, me either.
Disagree.
All right. Well, thank you, Bridget. Did any of the rest of our, Jason, go ahead.
Sure. Well, you'll see in my film, there's a voiceover narrative, and that's a film noir convention, voiceover. I used a colleague whose flat, very low-key affect was in keeping with film noir. There's music that's from several film noir soundtracks. And I used sound effects very sparingly at a pretty low volume, a crowd at the beginning of the film, street traffic, a door slamming shut, bus station and airport sounds, just to sort of lend a kind of ambient fabric to the sound.
Okay. Yes, there were a lot of film noir audio conventions in that, which I thought were, I don't know, I'll say fun to kind of unwind and play with, you know, to see how they were being worked in there to recreate that world and then being commented on. So,
Right.
Richard, did you want to, can I ask you, will you comment on I guess we'll call it a music track of your piece? It seems, I don't know, I couldn't exactly place what kind of music that was, but it is an interesting counterpoint to the sort of humorous, what unravels as a humorous kind of commentary on this, your central story.
Right, I incorporated the audio to have some sense of affect there, and the source of the audio is an interesting point for me to share with people because it's actually a little bit of a pop culture reference. It is a clip that was popular about 10 years ago called Nyan Cat, which was this little digital cat with the body of a Pop-Tart that was floating in outer space. And that sound that gets repeated is just Nyan, which is the Japanese word for cat. It's also onomatopoeic, so that's the sound that a cat makes. But this clip was something that I found on public domain. It's just slowed down 1000%. So it makes it a lot more dramatic, a lot more orchestral. And I appropriated that sound for my piece because I liked how it was a bit absurd, but at the same time, it helped me dramatize the narrative that I was telling. So it's a little interesting piece of information to share because on one hand, it sounds synthetic. On the other hand, it sounds a bit like an orchestra.
Mm-hmm.
And it sets you up for drama to me. It seems serious to me. And it's interesting how that sets you up one way. And then as the text unrolls while you're watching through it and you're learning about this little puppy, and then also the way you're playing with language, and the relationship right between French and Indochine and your own history as a pet owner, if you will, in there, how that is a different kind of texture than that and how playful that is, I guess. Can I ask Sarah really quick about sound? I'm only going to ask specifically, you can say whatever you'd like, but I thought your use of your lead, at least in the piece that I saw, the lead character's voiceover was so intimate and specific. I don't know how else to say that. It was really careful and deliberate and kind of beautiful in its own way. How did you think about approaching that voice work?
Yeah, I had commissioned, I did like a small batch of like informal auditions, and then had commissioned a colleague of mine at the time to do the voiceover. And it was one of those lucky things where he really just had the right timbre and tone of his voice. Because what I was aiming to achieve was, again, kind of that sense of like you're maybe bundled up in a blanket, you're in your bed, you're cozy and you're safe, and someone is telling you a soft little dark fairy tale that is kind of supposed to caution you. It might be spooky, but you're also kind of enveloped. You know that you are safe. So it's balancing the darkness outside the house with the house itself. You can't have the darkness without the light of that, and the safety of the house. So I was lucky in that he was a really good fit for that. I would also say that although this piece does have atmospheric music that's heavily sampled from a lot of places, I just kind of was really mishmashing it together in the atmospheric, non-diegetic sound of the piece. A lot of the work is meant to feel accessible in terms of like there's tricks into the trade. It's meant to be kind of like magic inducing, but the stop motion medium, it reminds me of when I was young and I would do stop motion. Like I would animate poorly, but I would, take still images and create a sense of story between them. And that interstitial space where the magic happens is a space of imagination. And so there's a way in which I see the stop motion medium, and the sound work to some extent is part of this as well as an accessible medium that even kids, anyone could really like pick up a few things and just by putting them in sequence tell a small little narrative. And I was actually curious if Bridget felt that way too, although I think actually all of the work in this curated reanimation part of the exhibit, I think they all function in that way.
Bridget, did you want to respond?
Well, what am I supposed to be? I'm not sure what I'm responding to.
No worries. It was just a thought that I had in the moment, but
go ahead, say it again so I understand what you mean.
Well, I feel like the physical stop motion animation feels more accessible to me, that anybody could potentially also do it. Maybe not the like back end technical putting it all together and sharing it, but it felt sometimes stop animation feels like play to me in a way that like children put pieces together, and in that interstitial space of imagination they're creative and creating a narrative that isn't there except for themselves. And I see that in my work and with fairy tale, and I thought I saw it in your piece as well.
Oh yes, absolutely. I mean, I'm so with you about what you're talking about. In fact, what you said earlier on the retelling and reshaping stories and this light and dark, all of the notions that you're talking about speak to me as well, and speak to my way of thinking about narrative and how I create these artificial fantastical universes and populate them. So I guess the problem is I'm nodding away here and I'm not seeing it as a question, but as, yeah, way to go. This is exactly what I'm thinking. So I'm sorry I didn't respond in that sense, because I'm so very much attracted to the way you're talking about your storytelling.
Sarah's comment made me think of, as a kid making flip books.
I was thinking that too.
Yeah, so it's fundamental for a lot of people, I guess.
I'm glad you brought that up, but that was also what I was thinking too, so thank you.
Well, in flip books and stop animation, to talk about my history of animation class, I don't know why I keep bringing it up. Is what we learn in the first weeks, or at least the first iterations of it. And so it's interesting, it gets to that idea of beginnings, and you talked about childhood, Sarah, that anyone can do it. And, you know, it can become so, and I got something on me. Sometimes animation can be so lofted technically, because, you know, like some of the $1 million movies that come out now, it takes a lot of artists to create them, but there's still something very pure you can do with animation on a small scale, just at home with objects, and in the old days, still photography, and still line them up and create motion in its purest sense. All right, I have one more sort of technical, Stuart, this goes till 2:30, right?
Yes.
Okay, so I have one other question of this type that we've been going over, that I think you all, again, are doing something with. Can you talk about something with my students? And I spend a lot of time worrying about it too as a filmmaker, is even if it's just your title credit sequence, your end credits, a lot of you go beyond that because you actually used physical text on the screen to tell part of your stories. How did you approach how you're gonna use text, not only from a subject level, but from the actual visual way you're gonna present it, space-wise, font-wise? You all do something very different, whether you use it a little or a lot. Does anyone want to talk about the importance of text and text design?
Well, for me, it was, an opportunity, or it was the big reveal of the film. And so I remember reading something that Stanley Kubrick said, which was that the opening and closing credits of a film should be the least sort of interesting or dynamic thing about the film, that it should just be purely informational. And I think if you think about, especially, I don't know, like in the last 20 years, where the opening credits are, really jazzed up. And so it's kind of the antithesis of that. So anyway, with me, it was, like I said, the big reveal, and I wanted it to be just as kind of simple and straightforward, and just a basic, screen crawl with that information.
And before we see anyone else, it also looked like your font was evoking a certain time period, and it felt typewritery, I guess I would say. Was that intentional?
Yeah, it was.
Or like newsprint, I should say.
Right, yeah. Just to, yeah, exactly, to somewhat evoke a period.
And you talk about news clippings, so that too. Does anyone else want to talk about how they use text?
Well, is it all right if I go?
Yes, it's good. Go ahead, Bridget.
The opening credits for mine, which you actually showed, I used an animated drawing where I drew the name of the piece. And I also, on the backdrop of that, I had created a graffiti that was the Red Baiters, which are the resistance in the work. So for me, part of it is playing around with what looks similar to Jason, that it seems of the world that it's situated into. So when I choose a font or a presentation, I want it to feel complete within that world, and that the ending credit is pretty simple, but I also create a background because I'm a more is more type of girl. So I don't necessarily have things against just a stark background, but I want to still continue the evocativeness of the fantasy world that I've created.
You are more is more. You have a lot of different things going on.
That's been me. Yep.
You see different things every time. When I watch, I do. Sarah, Richard, did you want to talk about text? You don't have to. No.
Sure, I can go next.
Yeah.
So for me, the text is very crucial in my piece since there is no speech, and I wanted to have multiple languages in my video since that was initially where the idea for the piece came from. It's interesting because although I do incorporate 3 languages in terms of the text that's there, it's all really just this inner monologue that I'm imagining. So I think most pet owners can attest to projecting onto their pets, coming up with these stories. If they're somehow in the bathtub, we make up this narrative of how they got in there. And I think for me, it's mostly just the dialogue that's happening internally, really just a monologue, thinking in English, but then the Vietnamese repeats what's said in English, and the French is my imagining that Lulu is saying these things, but it's all just redundancy. It's just repetition. And I think I was interested in what kind of emotion that could evoke. So interestingly, the idea of a hybrid creature or having that kind of space created through hybridity is something that comes from post-colonial studies, and that was influencing me in terms of what kind of meaning I could create by utilizing more than one language.
Well, and in your piece, the French specifically, I don't know, I can read French because I had 5 years of it and it really brought her alive and made it seem like different, like there was your voice and then she came alive, both through the text and just how the physical language looks. So that was so much fun to unravel that during its run. Sarah, did you want to say anything about it?
Yeah, I can
Then we'll open it to people, Q&A.
Sure. Yeah, I can quickly jump in. Using Century Schoolbook as the typeface is someone that, I teach type. I always know the typeface I'm using. But because typeface is also a kind of language, right? The form of it is a vehicle, but it's not neutral, and it has many, many, many historical uses before you pick up a typeface, and you wouldn't use Helvetica isn't neutral, Times New Roman isn't neutral. Anyway, so the history and kind of the significance of Century Schoolbook is that it is for a younger audience. It has a higher X height. It's meant to be just like really quickly digested and to give a sense of, or to give the illusion that it's slightly educating you. So it's kind of alluding to that didactic function of fairy tale. It's trying to like bring you back to that space of early storytelling, that space of imagination. And then similar maybe to what Richard said, where there's the kind of textual communication, that messaging, and then there's another messaging of what might be imagined. There's also voiceover, which is reading it to you, but then there are moments where the text disappears and you kind of just have to trust the narrator. And then sometimes things are happening without the narrator or the text, and you're meant to be feeling like you're now alone with this story, and it might be just bubbling up into the space of the wild. And so the text and then the narrator are all kind of functioning to tie us to senses of stability in some ways, and then release us from that as well.
Excellent. Yes, that was Century Schoolbook. And again, it goes with it's a book too. But wow, every font has a history like that. We have to know that, right? I feel like I should excerpt that, put that in front of my kids every time they just either pick the default or they pick something randomly. I'm like, but everything's information, you guys. There's something, you're always saying something. Everything's a choice. All right. If whether you want to do it in the chat or you'd like to speak up, if you have a question for everyone or a particular artist, please speak up now. And Stuart, I'll let you facilitate this. Please don't be shy.
Our viewers should be able to unmute themselves and ask a question if they like. And if you'd like or would prefer, feel free to type that in the comments.
Hi, I have a question. Well, hi, Bridget. Hi,
Hi, Emily.
I'm a past student of Bridget's at Simmons. Bridget taught me drawing, actually. So it's nice to see you. I haven't seen you at all since, well, the pandemic, but then before that. So it's nice to see you on this. And thank you, everyone. I've really enjoyed listening and learning about your beautiful and really unique artwork. My question is, I enjoyed hearing how all of your art is connected through power, through violence, oppression, through gender, and essentially the world's inequalities. And I think in my own artwork, I often think about like a fantasy and how I wish the world was, or how I want things to be. And my question is, how much of your work is about kind of escaping our current really difficult times, especially with, you know, everything that's going on currently? How much of your artwork is about escaping that, but then also how much of it is also about really addressing the world's inequalities and injustices head on? Or is it a little bit of a combination of both? And this question is for anyone who feels comfortable to answer. Thank you.
Well, since I know you, Emily, I'll answer. And it's great to see you. I would say for me, it's a combination, because intellectually, by creating an alternate world, like a theatrical construct. If you go to the theater, you accept, when you sit in the audience, you accept things that happen, even though they're not real, not just within the narrative, but, you know, it's not like you're sitting in the audience and there's this kind of fourth wall, and the things beyond that are the fantasy part. So I like that. But I also I like, you know, escaping. But I also like the fact of how you can use art to examine things that you're worried about, like injustice. And that because it's not tied to the absolute reality, you have more scope to play around with it. And maybe your viewers might get a different look at something than they would have if you just wrote them an essay. And that's sort of my impetus.
Yeah, I would follow up in terms of echoing those sentiments and saying that an essay isn't going to convey the same information or even affect that art does. So for me, even though I've studied some of the ideas that I've cited, such as hybridity or Panavong Narinder's book Phantasmatic Indochina, I do take those ideas seriously, but in terms of what I can do with those ideas, I think through those ideas through my practice. So even though I'm employing something that seems like a parody or a caricature, I'm using that to talk about these issues in a way that is effective for me, and it won't do the same thing as a book or an essay, but it's working within the parameters of visual culture. So I think in terms of escapism, that is there for me, but the issues that I'm thinking about are often rooted in something within the real world. So I refer to something historically, or if I'm choosing to do something contemporary, I refer to a current event.
Okay.
Hi, Bridget.
Hi, Linda.
First of all, I'm a friend of Bridget's. I live in the Boston area too, visual artist. And it was very nice to hear all of you and to see the little clips of your work. So I'll have to go and look at the longer versions. I do have to say that it was interesting to me that both the pieces by the two men were in black and white, and that the two women's work was kind of more playful and colorful. And Sarah, I was thinking of Catherine Streeter when I saw your work a little bit. I don't know if you know her collages, but your work has a you know, kind of a real collage feel to it. And Bridget, I thought of William Kentrick when I saw your work because of his
Big influence.
the
Yeah.
quirkiness and the interesting way, you know, you know, because I think both of you are handling materials, you know, it's a tactile thing, making the animations that way. It's not just filmic, it's that physical tactile quality I enjoyed. So it was interesting to see the variety and the connections and so on. So I appreciated being here today. That's all.
Thanks, Linda.
You're welcome.
I could just say thank you. And there's definitely a couple of the other artists that I haven't mentioned as being influential in this kind of work are the brothers Quay, who are very absurdist animators, but also even like Terrence Gilliam, who animated the Monty Python series, and it was a very big influence on me growing up. And I think that there is something really wonderful that can happen when you juxtapose, essentially, which is, I mean, collage is one of the mediums that really lends itself to that kind of jump, that imaginative jump, when you juxtapose two things that never would have been together. There's a book by Edward de Bono called Lateral Thinking, which influences my design practice, but I bring it into collage, and to some of the ways that I've created these stop motions is very much collage, in that the kind of kaleidoscopic combination that or combinations that you can come up with, that the medium of collaging kind of bring out, open up doors that never would have been, you know, you never would have put those two things next to each other normally. And now that they are, you're making references that are interesting, and you can respond to those and then bring the work to something else. So there is a way that it is a generative process. And so it's great that you picked up on that.
Thank you. Anyone else want to speak to one of the artists or all of them? We have just, I think we're probably on our last question if anyone's got anything they need to say. All right. Well then, Stuart, I think we'll close. I want to thank all the artists for sharing their wonderful work, and also so many great ideas. I wrote down a bunch of stuff that I was inspired by, you know, all of your work and what you said today, which I can use, because again, like I started, I'm tired of winter and I'm tired of being cooped up, and yes, I love being inspired. So let's thank Jason, Sarah, Richard, and Bridget for their work. Thank you for being here. You can watch this again. They're gonna put it up on the NIU Art Museum website. And then also, I think, Stuart, what's this? Just one more time, if people wanted to watch any of the whole work, we're gonna have the links for I think 2 or 3 of the films. Are they already up somewhere? Or?
Yes, they are in the chat now, so you're welcome to find those. The Art Museum's website is also in the chat if you'd like to visit virtual portions of the exhibition. And we can post these also on our website. Once the video is processed for web viewing, we'll post the links as well.
Real quick, Stuart, do you guys see the links or the
No, I don't.
website in the chat? I do not either. I see other things, but I don't see that.
Okay, I can repost those.
Okay.
Great. And thank you, Randy. This was a lot of fun and great.
Well, and you guys
questions.
were great. You were well, you know, sometimes people don't talk, and you guys had really ready to answer and ready to converse, and so many, and I love that you're all so different, but then there are these common things, and it's really exciting. So I appreciate it. And I look forward to seeing more from you guys. So, oh, good. Now we can see the links.
Yes, great.
Wonderful.
Thank you, everyone.
All right.
Yes.
Thanks, everyone.
Goodbye,
Thank you all
everybody.
thank you all for joining us this afternoon for the screening, conversation, and dialogue. If you're watching locally, the exhibition does close today. You're welcome to visit our website, www.niu.edu/art museum, to schedule a free timed, masked, and physically distanced entry. You can explore the elements of the exhibition virtually on our website after it closes if you're unable to make it in person. Thank you again to our panelists and our moderator, Randy Kasperson. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Randy. Thanks, Stuart.
Bye.
Wow.
Thank you all.